Tamara Wells had just finished a long day of meetings, her mind focused on the community outreach programs she had been working on. As a rising star in local politics, she was passionate about making a difference in her community. She was also the state senator for her district, a role she had worked tirelessly to achieve. But on this evening, as she drove back to her apartment, she didn't expect what was about to unfold. The sun had just started to set, casting a warm glow over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Tamara's car cruised along the streets, the calm of the evening offering her a moment to relax. She had been driving for about 10 minutes when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. She sighed, pulling her car over to the side of the road, wondering what had gone wrong this time. As she came to a stop, the officer's car parked behind her. Tamara glanced at the rearview mirror and saw a woman in a police uniform step out of the car. The officer looked stern, walking toward her vehicle with purpose. Tamara rolled down her window, preparing herself for the usual small talk that came with being stopped. The officer, whose nameplate read Barker, didn't greet Tamara politely like most officers did. Instead, she leaned toward the car with a sharp expression. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" she asked, her voice cold. Tamara raised an eyebrow, confused. "No, officer. I'm not sure why." Officer Barker didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked around at the area, her eyes scanning Tamara's car and the surrounding neighborhood. "You don't look like you belong around here," the officer said bluntly, with an edge of suspicion in her tone. "Where are you going?" Tamara's confusion deepened. "I live here," she explained, maintaining her calm demeanor. "I'm just coming from a meeting." Barker didn't seem convinced. She stared at Tamara for a moment, sizing her up, and then asked, "Can I see your ID and registration?" Tamara handed over the documents without a word. As she did, she noticed that Officer Barker wasn't being as polite as usual. There was a certain judgment in her eyes, as if Tamara's presence in this neighborhood was somehow questionable. Barker glanced at the ID, but then her eyes widened slightly as she saw the name. Tamara Wells, State Senator. The officer's eyes narrowed, and a strange smile crept across her face. "A state senator, huh?" she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "What's someone like you doing here?" Tamara felt a wave of frustration wash over her, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm just a regular person, officer. I live in this community, and I work to make it better." Instead of showing any respect for Tamara's role, Officer Barker took another step closer, looking down at her with obvious doubt. "Well, Miss Wells, I think we need to sort this out," she said, her tone now hostile. Tamara's heart sank. She knew what was coming. As Officer Barker stood by Tamara's car, the tension in the air was palpable. Tamara, feeling a surge of frustration, tried to stay calm. She had been stopped by police before, but something about this interaction felt different. Officer Barker was treating her as though she didn't belong, as though her presence in the neighborhood was somehow suspicious. Tamara had worked too hard and fought too long for the respect she had earned, but now she was being judged solely on her appearance. "Step out of the car," Officer Barker suddenly ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. Tamara hesitated for a moment, trying to understand why she was being treated this way. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. I just want to go home." But Officer Barker wasn't having it. "I said, step out of the car," she repeated, her hand resting on her holster. Tamara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She had never been in a situation like this before. She could feel the eyes of a few curious bystanders watching from a distance, but she was alone in this. She took a deep breath and slowly got out of the car, keeping her hands visible. As she stood beside her vehicle, Officer Barker didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she just looked at Tamara with a critical eye. "I don't know what's going on with you, but I'm not letting you off so easily," she said. "I'm going to have to run a background check." Tamara's heart raced, but she refused to let the officer see her fear. "I've done nothing wrong." "You're wasting my time," she said firmly, standing tall. Officer Barker's eyes hardened. "We'll see about that," she muttered, taking a step back and reaching for her radio. "Dispatch, I need a background check on this individual. Tamara Wells, State Senator." Tamara felt a rush of anger but stayed quiet, letting the officer continue her work. She couldn't believe what was happening. She had fought her whole life for equality and respect, and now here she was, being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of her skin. The irony of it all hit her. She, a state senator, was being treated with suspicion in her own neighborhood, simply because someone thought she didn't belong. A few long moments passed, and Officer Barker finally returned her attention to Tamara. "Your record seems clean," she said grudgingly, as if it was a surprise. "But I'm still not convinced. I'll need to detain you while I finish my investigation." At that moment, Tamara knew she couldn't just let this go. She had to stand up for herself, not only for her own dignity, but for all the people who faced the same kind of discrimination every day. "Officer," she said calmly, "you've made a mistake. I've been honest with you. I'm the state senator for this district, and I deserve to be treated with respect. I expect an apology for this." The officer's eyes flickered with surprise at the mention of Tamara's position, but before she could respond, a second police car arrived, and another officer stepped out. Tamara didn't know what would happen next, but she was ready to stand her ground. As the second police car pulled up, Tamara's nerves were on edge. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she knew she couldn't back down now. She had worked too hard for everything she had achieved, and she wasn't going to let anyone undermine her dignity or position. The new officer who stepped out of the car was a man, tall and calm. He walked toward Tamara and Officer Barker, assessing the situation with a quick glance. Tamara noticed that he seemed to look at her with a mixture of curiosity and caution, but there was no immediate judgment in his eyes, unlike Officer Barker's. "Is there a problem here?" the new officer asked, his tone neutral but professional. Officer Barker hesitated for a moment before responding. "I've pulled this woman over, and I've been questioning her. She claims to be the state senator, but I still got some concerns." Tamara stood tall and spoke up without hesitation. "I'm Tamara Wells, the state senator for this district, and I was simply on my way home. I haven't broken any laws, and I certainly don't deserve to be treated like this." The new officer turned his attention to her, clearly evaluating the situation more carefully. "State senator, you say?" he asked, his expression softening. "I wasn't aware of that." Tamara nodded firmly. "That's right. I spent years fighting for the rights of my community. You should have verified my identity before making any assumptions." The officer seemed to realize that something wasn't right about the situation. He glanced back at Officer Barker, who was still standing with her arms crossed, looking slightly uncomfortable. "I think we need to clear this up right now," the new officer said. He turned to Tamara and asked, "Would you be willing to show me your identification and your credentials?" Tamara didn't hesitate. She reached into her purse and handed him her state senator ID. The officer took a moment to look at it, and then back at her. "I see," he said, nodding slowly. "I apologize for the misunderstanding, ma'am. It seems there was an error. You shouldn't have been detained or questioned like this. I'll handle the situation from here." Tamara felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had stood her ground, but she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of frustration. Officer Barker had made her feel small, judged, and unwelcome, simply because of her appearance. And yet here she was, showing her credentials, and being treated like a criminal. "I appreciate that," Tamara said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm afraid it's not just a misunderstanding. This treatment needs to be addressed. No one should ever feel like this just because of the way they look or where they live." The new officer, now fully aware of the situation, nodded. "I agree with you, and I'll make sure this is dealt with properly." As he turned to Officer Barker, Tamara could see the look of realization on her face. The officer knew she had made a mistake, and now she would have to answer for it. Tamara didn't know what would happen next, but she had already made her point. She wasn't going to let anyone's prejudice go unchecked. As the new officer spoke to Officer Barker, Tamara stood quietly, her arms crossed, watching the interaction carefully. She felt a mixture of relief and frustration. While she was glad the situation was being resolved, she couldn't shake the feeling that this could happen again to someone else if things weren't properly addressed. Officer Barker seemed to be growing more uncomfortable with every word exchanged. She had been caught off guard by Tamara's calm but firm approach, and now her mistakes were becoming too clear to ignore. The new officer, who had introduced himself as Officer Harris, continued speaking to her. "You need to understand, Officer Barker, that you can't just judge someone based on assumptions. Every person, no matter who they are, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity," Officer Harris said, his voice steady but firm. Tamara listened closely. She had seen people in power avoid uncomfortable situations before, but Officer Harris wasn't backing down. He was holding Officer Barker accountable, and that gave her hope. Barker, clearly flustered, finally nodded. "I understand, Officer Harris," she muttered, clearly regretting her actions. "It won't happen again." Tamara took a deep breath. "I appreciate your apology, but words are only the beginning," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's actions that matter most. I expect a full explanation and review of this situation. I won't let it slide." Officer Harris turned to Tamara, giving her a reassuring look. "I'll make sure everything is taken care of. You're right. This kind of treatment can't be tolerated. I'll report this incident, and there will be consequences. We'll make sure this department learns from its mistakes." Tamara nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. It was clear that Officer Harris was taking her concerns seriously. She was relieved that he wasn't brushing things under the rug, but she knew the journey didn't end here. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about ensuring that no one else would be unfairly treated in the future. "Thank you, Officer Harris," Tamara said, her voice softer now, but still strong. "But I expect to hear back soon. This needs to be addressed properly." Officer Harris nodded again. "You'll be contacted soon, Mom. Thank you for your patience." As Officer Barker stood there silently, Tamara gave her a final, steady look. She wasn't angry, but she was determined. There was a time for silence and a time for standing up. Today, she had chosen the latter. Tamara returned to her car, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. As she started the engine, she couldn't help but think about how this situation would play out. She was a state senator, yes, but she was also a woman who faced the same challenges as anyone else. The fight for fairness and equality wasn't over, but she was ready to continue that fight, one step at a time. As she drove away, Tamara knew that this experience, though painful, would be a catalyst for change. She had made a point today, and it was a point that would not be ignored. The days after the incident felt long, but Tamara was determined to ensure that this experience wasn't forgotten. She knew that just addressing the issue in the moment wasn't enough. Change had to happen at a deeper level. She was committed to seeing it through. The morning after her encounter with Officer Barker, Tamara went straight to her office at the state capitol. She had an important meeting with a committee on police reform that she had been planning for months. The timing felt significant. This was the moment to push for the changes she believed in. As she sat in her office, preparing for the meeting, her phone rang. It was Officer Harris. "Good morning, Ms. Wells," he said, his tone professional. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation from the other day." Tamara straightened in her chair, her mind sharp. "I'm glad you called. Have you been able to look into the situation?" "Yes, I have. I've spoken with the department's leadership, and we are reviewing Officer Barker's actions. There's no denying that she made a serious mistake. I'm putting together a report on the incident for further action." Tamara felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Officer Harris was keeping his word, and the situation was being handled. "I appreciate you taking this seriously," she said, "but I don't want it to stop there. I want this to be a part of a bigger conversation. We need to address how all people are treated, not just those in power, but everyone." Officer Harris paused. I understand, and I agree. We've already started looking into more extensive bias training for the entire department. That's good to hear, Tamara replied. But I also think it's time we hold departments accountable. We need regular oversight, and we need to make sure these issues are being addressed at the highest level. There was a pause before Officer Harris responded. You're right. I'll make sure that's included in the report, and we'll start drafting a proposal for a more comprehensive review. Tamara nodded, feeling hopeful. Thank you, Officer Harris. I'll be waiting to hear more about the next steps. After hanging up, Tamara felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was glad that the police department was taking the necessary steps, but she knew the real work had just begun. Now, it was time for her to continue her efforts on a broader scale. Later that day, during the police reform meeting at the Capitol, Tamara stood before the committee, her voice strong and clear. We cannot continue to ignore the biases that influence so much of the way people are treated, especially those in positions of power. We must create an environment where every citizen, regardless of their background, is treated fairly and with respect. Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from the room. Tamara knew this was just the beginning of a long fight, but the support she was seeing gave her confidence. After the meeting, several colleagues came up to her to express their support, and one even commented, "You're making a difference, Tamara. We all need to keep pushing for real change." Tamara smiled, grateful for the encouragement. This isn't just about one bad encounter. It's about making sure that everyone, no matter who they are, can live without fear of being unfairly judged. As she left the Capitol building that afternoon, Tamara felt a sense of hope. She knew there was still much work ahead, but she was ready to lead the charge for a more just and equal future. Weeks went by, and Tamara's efforts to push for police reform began to gain more attention. Her public support was growing, and her role as a state senator allowed her to reach people who were in positions to make a real difference. Still, she knew the work ahead of her was not easy. Change took time, and there were many obstacles to overcome. She spent long hours in meetings, drafting proposals, and discussing ideas with fellow lawmakers. Her passion for justice and equality fueled her every step, and slowly the momentum she had built began to grow. Other senators, and even some members of the police force, reached out to express their support for her ideas. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Tamara was sitting at her desk when she received a call. It was Officer Harris. "Good afternoon, Senator Wells," he said. "I wanted to give you an update on Officer Barker and the situation from a few weeks ago." Tamara sat up straight, eager to hear what had happened. "Please, go ahead." "I've reviewed the incident with the department's leadership," Officer Harris continued. "Officer Barker has been placed on probation, and she will undergo additional training on bias and respectful conduct. There will also be a series of community outreach programs that involve both officers and local residents. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Tamara felt a small sense of relief, but she knew that this was only part of the solution. "That's a good start," she said. "But I still believe we need more comprehensive reform. There has to be regular oversight, and we need to hold departments accountable." Officer Harris agreed. "I agree with you, Senator. I'm working on making sure that the department follows up with thorough training and community programs. But we'll need your help. We need the support of the public and the legislature to move forward with these changes." Tamara was determined. "I'll make sure we keep pushing for more. This won't stop with just one change. The real work is in ensuring fairness and accountability for the long term." Over the next few weeks, Tamara continued to champion her cause. She met with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and everyday citizens to gather more feedback and suggestions for reform. People in the community began to see her as not just a politician, but as a voice for those who had been silenced or ignored for too long. One evening, as Tamara was leaving the state capitol after another long meeting, she was stopped by one of her colleagues, Senator Jenkins. "I just wanted to tell you, Tamara, I'm proud of the work you're doing. I think you're really making a difference," he said. Tamara smiled, grateful for the support. Thank you, Senator Jenkins. It's not easy, but it's worth it. We have to keep pushing for what's right. As she left the building, Tamara felt a renewed sense of hope. The path ahead would still be difficult, and there were many challenges to face. But she was determined to continue fighting for a world where everyone, no matter who they were or where they came from, could be treated with the respect and fairness they deserved. Several months after the incident with Officer Barker, Tamara had made significant strides in her efforts to reform the police department and improve the community's trust in law enforcement. Her actions had sparked important conversations in the legislature and within the community, and the changes she had fought for were beginning to take shape. Tamara had introduced a series of new policies, including mandatory bias training for all police officers, community involvement programs, and more transparency in how police departments handled complaints and misconduct. She had also worked closely with Officer Harris, who had continued to show his support for the reforms. The atmosphere at the police department had shifted dramatically. There was now a genuine effort to engage with the community and ensure that the police force treated everyone fairly, regardless of their race or background. The leadership team had even agreed to implement quarterly review sessions to assess how well the new policies were being followed. Tamara's office was filled with calls and emails from citizens thanking her for her efforts. She was proud of the changes, but she knew that real change would take time. There were still people who doubted the system, and it would take years of consistent effort to build lasting trust. One afternoon, Tamara attended a community meeting in a small neighborhood park. She was greeted by a diverse group of residents, some of whom had been skeptical about the reforms in the beginning. But as Tamara spoke, she could see that their attitudes were starting to shift. The community was beginning to feel heard, and they saw Tamara as a leader who truly cared about their well-being. As she spoke with the group, one woman approached her. She was older, with a quiet demeanor, but her voice was firm when she spoke. "Senator Wells," she began, "I've lived in this community for years, and I've seen too many things that shouldn't have happened. You're doing something that's going to make a difference. I just wanted to say thank you." Tamara smiled and shook her hand. "Thank you. This is just the beginning. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're moving in the right direction." The woman nodded, a look of hope in her eyes. "We're behind you. We trust you." As the meeting came to a close, Tamara felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had worked hard to bring about change, but hearing the people's words of support made it all worthwhile. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was more determined than ever to continue fighting for fairness and equality. Back in her office, Tamara reflected on how far things had come. She thought about that night with Officer Barker and how it had pushed her to take action. What could have been a painful, discouraging experience had become the spark for something much bigger, something that could change the lives of countless people for the better. As she looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city, Tamara knew her work was far from over. But she also knew that with each step forward, they were getting closer to the world she had always envisioned, a world where fairness, respect, and equality were not just ideals, but a reality for everyone.